Bees had been living in this backyard shed for many years. The shed was going to be torn down, but the homeowners wanted to save the bees, so they called me. Behind the wall of the shed, I found a huge hive of very gentle bees. So I removed my veil and I began removing the hive. The first part of the hive that I removed was full of honey, so I took a bite out of the honeycomb and it was so good. Then I started to carefully remove the rest of the hive. These huge pieces of comb were full of baby bees and also a lot of beautiful pollen that the bees use for food. Whatever I removed from the original hive went right into the new hive so that the bees would have everything they needed to survive. I put the pieces of comb into frames using rubber bands to keep it in place. Then I just kept removing the hive piece by piece while looking for the queen. After I removed all of the comb, I started scooping bees into the new hive. Then all of a sudden, I saw the queen on the side of the shed. So I put her in a clip to keep her safe and I put her in the new hive. And pretty soon the entire colony was running into the new hive to be with their queen. It was getting dark and the bees needed more time to move in, so I left the hive overnight. When I returned the next morning, there were still some bees at the top of the shed, so I gave them some smoke and they began running into the new hive. Then I closed up the hive, I took them home, and it was another great day of saving the bees. Bees were living in this trash bin and I was called to remove them. At first, I only saw one piece of comb. It was full of food and baby bees, which the bees worked very hard for, so I put the comb into the new hive. Then I saw more bees at the bottom of the bin, so I took out the trash and some bees along with it, and I found the rest of the hive. Then I removed all of the comb from the trash bin and I put it into frames. Some bees were gathering on the outside of the bin, so I started scooping them into the new hive, and in the very first handful of bees I scooped, I found the queen. So I put her in a clip and I put her in the new hive. These bees were very gentle and were not trying to sting me, so I just kept scooping them off the side of the bin. Once I had enough bees in the new hive with their queen, they started telling the other bees where to go. All of a sudden, bees started running out of the trash bin and into their new hive. I waited for the bees to get in their new hive, then I took them home, and it was another great day of saving the bees. I just really love bees, and as a professional beekeeper, I spend most of my time around bees, so I've learned how to handle them, hold them, and help them if they need me. For me, having bees around me all the time is one of my favorite things about being a beekeeper, and being able to work alongside them makes every day another great day of saving the bees. A swarm of bees settled under this umbrella and I was called to remove them. So I started scooping bees off the umbrella and putting them into a hive. When bees are in swarms like this, it means they're looking for a new place to live. They tend to be very docile since they don't have any resources to defend. They don't have a hive, food, or baby bees to protect, but they should have a queen. So with every handful of bees I scooped, I spent time searching for the queen. I repeated this process over and over again. By the time I removed most of the bees, I still had not seen the queen, and I realized this was an unusual case of a queenless swarm. This colony would not survive without a queen, but luckily I had an extra one on me I could give them. As soon as I gave the queen to the colony, they rushed to meet her. If they didn't accept her, they would try to kill her. If they did accept her, they would release her from the box by chewing through the piece of candy that stops up one end. As soon as the bees in the hive met the new queen, they began sending signals to the other bees telling them to move off the umbrella and into the box. So I just waited in the swarm of bees as the colony moved into their new home. After about 15 minutes, most of the bees were with their colony, so I checked on the queen and saw that the bees were starting to accept her. I waited a while longer for the bees to get in their new hive, then I loaded them into my truck and drove home. I put the bees in my apiary so they could continue the important work they do in a place that's safer for them and for people, and it was another great day of saving the bees. It's that time of year when the female bees kick all the male bees out of the hive, and they don't let them back in, so they either starve or freeze to death. Since mating season is over and the male bees don't do any work inside the hive, they are really just extra mouths to feed in the winter when food is scarce. So the female bees have to kick the male bees out for the good of the colony and so the bees can survive until spring. I woke up one morning and my truck was covered with more bees than usual, so I ran outside in my pajamas to see what was going on. A swarm of bees that I caught the night before was leaving their hive and swarming again. I tried to offer their new hive back to them, but they weren't moving in very quickly, which told me that they wanted to go somewhere else. It was a race between me and the bees. I had to find the queen before the bees found a place to fly off to. After a few minutes, I found her. I put her in a clip to keep her safe, but before I could put her in the new hive, I had bees swarming to her in my hand. As soon as I put the queen in the hive, the bees began to go right in. I still had some bees on my hand who weren't leaving because they could still smell their queen on me. So I shook them off so they could find her. Within minutes, the entire colony was rushing to get back into their new hive. You can see how fast they were moving and how the queen was covered in bees. I waited for all the bees to get into their hive, and it was another great day of saving the bees in my pajamas. This is an undertaker bee, and it's her job to haul dead bee bodies out of the hive. This is just one of the many important jobs that every female worker bee does throughout her life for the survival of the colony and of the species. A swarm of bees that needed a new place to live settled under this table, and I was called to remove them. So I gave the bees a new hive and I started to move them in. When these bees left their old hive, they took their queen and as much food as their stomachs could hold, but they left everything else behind. That meant that there was no honeycomb, food, or baby bees here, and I could just scoop these bees up with my hands. These bees were very gentle, mostly because they didn't have a hive to protect, but they should have had a queen. So with every handful of bees I scooped, I was searching for the queen. It wasn't too long before I found her hiding under the table, so I put her in a clip to keep her safe and I put her in the new hive. I needed to get all of the bees into the new hive as quickly as possible so they wouldn't try to swarm again. So I just kept scooping handful after handful of bees into the hive. But there were still a lot of bees on the picnic table who didn't seem to know where to go. So I gave them a little bit of smoke to help them move along. The smoke does not harm the bees, they just move away from it like we do. So I used my smoker to herd the colony into the new hive. Then all of a sudden, some of the bees started to recognize the hive as their new home. They began sending signals to the other bees to tell them where to go. And all of the bees started to march down the leg of the table and into the new hive. I waited while the bees moved into their new hive, then I closed it up, I loaded it into my truck, and it was another great day of saving the bees. A honeybee colony is not a monarchy like many people think it is. The queen bee is actually not the leader of the hive, and she doesn't rule over all the other bees. It's the female worker bees who make the decisions for the colony, and they do so collectively as a group. The queen has one important job. She's in charge of laying all the eggs for the colony, and she is the only bee who can create more worker bees. So if the queen is doing her job well, the colony will follow her, protect her, and care for her. If the queen bee is not doing her job, or if she gets too old or dies, the female worker bees can choose to replace her and make a new queen. They can take any female worker bee egg and turn it into a queen bee by feeding it a special diet of royal jelly throughout its development. And so a hive can go on, generation after generation, with all the bees working together to do what's best for the good of the colony. Bees had been living in this washing machine and I was called to remove them. So I carefully lifted the lid, and I found a beautiful hive full of honey and very gentle bees. When I looked inside, I saw layer after layer of fresh honeycomb. The bees had worked so hard to build this hive, and I wanted to do everything I could to preserve it for them. So I started to remove the outermost parts of the hive with nectar and honey. Then I reached the heart of the hive, the brood nest. This is where the queen lays eggs and where the baby bees are born. Everything that I removed from the washing machine would be given right back to the bees in their new hive, but these pieces of comb were pretty big, so I had to cut them in half to fit into the wooden frames of the new hive. I secured each piece of comb to a frame using rubber bands, then I put the comb into the new hive. Next, I started scooping bees out of the washing machine and putting them into the new hive. As a professional beekeeper, the most important part of my job is being able to understand bee behavior, and I could tell that these bees felt comfortable with me as we worked together. After most of the comb had been removed from the washing machine, I looked around and suddenly I saw the queen at the back of the washing machine. She was a strong and beautiful queen, so I put her in a clip to keep her safe and I put her in the new hive. It looked like most of the colony had moved to the outside of the washing machine, so I used my smoker to herd them into the new hive using a little bee bridge I made for them. I scooped a few more handfuls of straggler bees into the new hive. Then I left the new hive there all afternoon. When I returned just before sunset, most of the bees had moved into the new hive, so I loaded the bees into my truck and we drove home. I had just enough daylight left, but I was able to get them settled into their new home in my apiary, and it was another great day of saving the bees. A swarm of bees landed on the scaffolding at the Tesla Gigafactory, and I was called to remove them. So I climbed up this ladder to meet the bees and figure out the best way to get them down. When I got to the top, I found a colony of very gentle bees, so I offered them a temporary travel hive and they started to move right in. These bees needed a safe place to live and enough food before winter, which would be very difficult for them to find so late in the year. Unfortunately, most swarms like this one don't survive their first winter, so I was happy to offer them a helping hand. I gave the bees some smoke to encourage them to move off the scaffolding and into the new hive. I waited and watched as more and more bees moved in, but I still didn't see any signs of a queen. So after the colony moved into the hive, I climbed down the ladder and loaded the bees into my truck to take them home. When I got home, I saw that my mail carrier had left an envelope at my front door with the queens that I ordered the week before. When queen bees are shipped in the mail, they are often sent in these little wooden boxes with corks at each end, a few attendant bees, and some fondant for food. So I removed the cork at the end of the box next to the food. This would allow the bees to eat their way through the fondant and make a tunnel for their queen to exit the box. So I put the queen in her new home, but I still had to get the bees in there, so I just shook them off the temporary travel hive. I waited for the bees to move into their new hive, but these bees still needed some more help. So I put the bees in my apiary and I opened the hive next to them. These bees were very healthy and had plenty of resources to spare, which meant that they could donate some to the bees in need. So I took some food and some brood from the strong colony, and I gave it to the weaker one to help them survive. Then I closed up both of the hives, I made sure the bees had everything they needed, and it was another great day of saving the bees. Bees had been living in this backyard shed for at least 2 years. The landlord wanted to call an exterminator, but the family who lived here wanted to save the bees, so they called me. When I lifted up the floor, I found a huge hive full of gentle bees. The hive was so big I had to remove another section of floor to access the entire thing. Then I started removing the hive. Whatever I removed from the original hive went right into the new one so the bees would have everything they need to survive. After I removed all of the comb, I started scooping bees into the new hive. As soon as I put the bees by the new hive, they marched right in. Then a stream of bees began running out from under the floor into the new hive. So I waited and watched to see if I could spot the queen bee in the crowd. After about 15 minutes, she appeared, so I put her in a clip to keep her safe. Once the queen was in the new hive, some bees began sending signals to help the other bees find their way home. I left the hive overnight, and by the next day, the entire colony was in their new home, and it was another great day of saving the bees. A small swarm of bees had gathered on this tennis court, and I was called to remove them. But once I got there, I realized this colony was in more trouble than it seemed. Their queen was dead, and because the bees were so loyal to their queen, they refused to leave her behind. They were still trying to attend to her and take care of her little bee body. So I put the queen's body in the new hive. It took the bees a few minutes to realize she had moved, but once they found her, they rushed to her and started to care for her in the new hive. So I waited for all the bees to get into their new hive, but since this colony was so small already, they needed more than a new queen to survive. They needed to join a new colony. So once I got the bees home, I put them in a standard beehive box, but I couldn't just put them with another colony and a new queen right away, or that could cause confusion, chaos, and fighting among the bees. So I put a layer of newspaper between them. The newspaper would keep the colony safe and separated while the bees got used to each other's scents. So I closed up the hive. When I checked on the bees a few days later, the bees had chewed through the newspaper, and the two colonies had merged together to become one, and it was another great day of saving the bees. I got a call to remove bees from one of the weirdest places ever, this toilet. The bees had been living in the tank of this toilet for years, and they filled the entire space with comb and had no room left to grow. So I got to work removing the hive. Everything I removed from the original hive was safe for the bees to have in their new home. Here's what the comb looked like. This piece had honey at the top, pollen below, and brood on the bottom. I spent a lot of time carefully removing each piece of comb. This was a happy and healthy colony of honeybees, and they were not stinging me at all. After I removed all of the comb, the toilet was still full of bees, which told me the queen was in there. Suddenly, I saw her crawling up the side of the tank. I put her in a clip to keep her safe, and I placed her in the new hive. Then I made a little bee bridge that led straight to the queen so the bees could easily get to their new hive. It worked and the bees marched right in. After the bees started to recognize the bee box as their new home, I closed up the hive, I waited for the colony to move into the box, then we drove home and it was another great day of saving the bees.